Set your data tellers to receive new information, because today we're doing a full review of the new Admech Codex for 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we'll be reviewing the new Admech Codex, a hotly awaited codex that I've certainly been looking forward to reviewing myself, and it looks like we've got some very interesting changes for the servants of the Omnissiah. This is the rough contents of the Admech Codex. As usual, there's some fairly extensive lore and miniature galleries, all the Crusade rules content, and then all the rules for using the army in regular games of 40k. In this review I'll be focusing on the rules for match play. There's plenty enough to be going on with on that front. First of all, we have some core army rules: Obsec, Knight of the Cog, and the Doctrinas and Canticles of the Omnissiah. 30 datasheets, including 2 new ones, the Skitarii Marshall and the Technoarchaeologist. Many of those have been reimagined, lots have upgraded guns, and the units have new points values. We've got plenty of stratagems, several ones gone but plenty of new ones, the various options for upgrading characters, a page of relics, 6 Warlord Traits for Tech Priests and 6 for Skitarii, and the Holy Order upgrade abilities that you can give to Tech Priests. We've got 7 Forge Worlds, each with a dogma, trait, stratagem and relic, an expanded list of custom Forge World options, and then 4 unique secondaries. In this review we'll talk through each section with a little bit of discussion as to which rules I think are going to be strongest. So first up we have the core army's rules then. As per normal, if your detachment's all from one Forge World, they'll gain the dogma for that Forge World. The only units that don't get the dogma are the regular servitors. Kataphron servitors do get dogmas. You get Obsec for all troops, both Kataphrons and the Skitarii. Kataphrons are troops but lost core. There's a special rule for Knight of the Cog, which allows you to include a super heavy auxiliary detachment for a Adeptus Mechanicus knight. That knight can go alongside your Admech and not ruin your Canticles of the Omnissiah or Doctrina imperatives. Quite a nice option to be able to field 1 big knight or 3 armigers alongside your forces. Speaking of which, the Admech have 2 sets of whole army buffs, but most of the time they only affect half of the army each. To get the Doctrina imperatives and Canticles of the Omnissiah, every model in your army must be Admech, and they're both lists of abilities that allow you to select one at the start of each battle round. The Doctrinas are for the Skitarii units, and the Canticles are for the Cult Mechanicus units, though there is a bit of overlap, as if you play Mars then the Skitarii units get Canticles as well. Finally, Bionics are a common rule that is still a thing. You get a 6+ invul save normally, but quite a lot of models have enhanced Bionics now, giving you a 5+ invul save on characters, and certain elite units such as Infiltrators, Taraxi and Cerberus. Not too bad for a little bit of extra durability. Let's start out with a look at these army-wide rules then, the Doctrinas and the Canticles. As we said, you only get these if you're full Admech, but Agents of the Imperium, unaligned units such as Fortifications, and Knights of the Cog are allowed. You don't have to have your entire army be 1 Forge World for these to apply either, so you still get your Doctrinas and your Canticles, even if say you had a detachment of Riser alongside a detachment of Mars for example. First up we have the Doctrina imperatives. There's 4 here, and if you want you can select one of these each battle round, only if a Doctrina assembler character is on the board, which does include pretty much all of the characters. As we said, these only affect the Skitarii units, not the Cult Mechanicus ones such as say Kataphrons or Castellans. Each Doctrina gives you a buff and a deprecation, which is a negative, and there's 4 to choose from. Protector will buff your ballistic skill, so +1 to hit, but give you a -1 to your weapon skill. Conqueror will give you +1 to weapon skill but cost you 1 ballistic skill. Bulwark will give you +1 to your save but -3-inch movement, and Aggressor will give you +3-inch movement but -1 to your save. They're really quite big benefits and trade-offs here. It does kind of incentivize your entire army to go down one theme, so say they might all be benefiting from the Protector one for the extra ballistic skill, without having any assault troops on the same turn just about to charge into melee, as you don't want to completely ruin their damage output with -1 weapon skill. You can get around this a little bit with the Skitarii Marshall, as we'll get on to later. I think Protector will likely get used in almost every game. If you don't need to move too much, then Bulwark is an amazing durability buff, +1 save across your whole army pretty much is amazing, and I think that Aggressor maybe might be a little bit more niche. Sometimes a little bit of extra movement could really make a big deal, but -1 to your save characteristics is going to be a really hefty hit. You can't use these every round as there's only 4, so you're only going to be able to have 4 turns of Doctrinas normally. but I think that even then you might only want one or two of them, as quite a lot of the time the deprecations are going to outweigh the buffs. I could see something like either starting in Bulwark if you go second, and maybe then going forward to Protector when the armies are engaged and your opponent's exposed, and you can really unload some hefty firepower. The flip side for the Cult Mechanicus units are the Canticles of the Omnissiah. These ones are all just flat buffs, and you don't need a character present on the board. You just literally choose one of these each turn. Unlike in the previous edition, you can't roll for these anymore, you just have to pick them one by one, and there's not quite as much scope for manipulating them as there was before. Only a few units can manipulate certain units being in different Canticles. On an army-wide basis, you can't recycle the ones that you've already used. In general though, I do think that they've managed to balance them out a little bit more. There's less ones that are absolute complete duds than before now, though the strong ones still remain very useful. Shroud's Arm gives all your Cult Mechanicus units light cover, and could be particularly interesting on Mars Skitarii units as well. Maybe you could combine that with Bulwark with a pretty crazy +2 to your saves across the whole army for a turn. Chant of the Remorseless Fist gives you +1 strength, not too bad at all when you're getting mixed up in melee. Incantation of the Iron Soul gives you ignore combat attrition modifiers and a 5+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, though a 4+ if you're Grier. This one's maybe the most niche, perhaps most useful if you're just about to take a bucket load of smites perhaps. Benediction of the Omnissiah remains one of the best. Each time your unit shoots, you get to reroll one hit roll, wound roll and damage roll. This is really powerful on multiple small units. It could add up to an absolute ton of rerolls across a whole Admech shooting phase. Things like small units of Cataphren Breachers or Destroyers are going to absolutely love this, or things like Skitarii Iron Striders if you're Mars. Invocation of Machine Vengeance gives you +1d6 and drop the lowest whenever you make advance or charge rolls. That's actually a really significant buff to charges. You're going to be averaging over an 8-inch charge range now. Definitely a good one if you are going to make any sort of a risky charge in your turn. And finally, Litany of the Electromancer gives all your units -1 to hit in melee. Maybe could be one to throw down later game if your opponent is about to do some mass charging themselves. I think in general, Shroud's Arm and the Benediction of the Omnissiah are likely the strongest, potentially very good choices for turn 1 and 2, though the rest are all pretty handy for melee-focused Admech lists. Maybe if you're running Riser or something with loads of combat units, you could potentially get some very solid value at a +1 strength, -1 to hit, or boosted charge range. Overall, they look very solid, and I think that it's going to lead to Admech armies having a very solid turn 1 and 2. So next up, let's move on to the revamped stratagem list. There's quite a lot of new ones, but a fair few have disappeared altogether. Things like Gloria Mechanicus to change the army's canticles, and a few other flat damage increase ones. Starting off with battle tactics, we have 2 command points for Zealous Congregation. This used to be fight twice for Electro Priests, now it's 6s to hit auto wound for Electro Priests in melee. I guess that could be pretty handy if you are fighting something very tough, maybe something like a vehicle, but 2 CP really is quite steep unless you're going in with a really big unit indeed. I'd say it's an okay buff, not enormously outstanding. Next for 1 CP we have Outriders. An Iron Strider, Dragoon or Cerberus unit can auto-advance 6 inches. Heavy weapons count as assault weapons, and assault weapons ignore the -1 to hit penalty. This could be handy just to stretch onto an objective, but maybe is best with the Cerberus Sulphur Hounds, as they could often really use an extra little bit of movement just to make sure that they get all of those 12-inch shots in range. Next we have Assassin Constructs for 1 CP. This just gives your Sicarians, the Ruststalkers or the Infiltrators +1 attack in the first round of melee. Can't go too far wrong here, just a flat damage boost if you need it. For 1 CP we have Electromancer's Wrath. 1 unit within 12 inches of a unit of Electro Priests takes D3 mortal wounds on the roll of a 2 to 5, or 2d3 on the roll of a 6. That could be a really nice little stratagem just to try and finish off an enemy injured unit if you run out of things to do so. For 1 CP, Machine Superiority gives you +1 strength to a Skitarii unit, maybe strength 4 Rangers or Vanguard, strength 9 Dragoons, or very nice buffs indeed on Infiltrators or Ruststalkers. Elimination Volley is one of the best Cataphren buffs in the Codex. For 1 CP, any 6s that they get to hit with their shooting attacks will auto-wound. Could maybe be pretty handy on arc rifles or grav cannons, both of which have relatively low strength. Easily could be worth it in a big 6-man unit. Moving on to the Epic Deeds, we have 1 command point for Data Spike. A Tech Priest in melee with a vehicle will deal D3 mortal wounds on a 2 to 5, or 2d3 on the roll of a 6. Benevolence of the Omnissiah gives vehicles a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, quite a powerful debuff that one. Tech Adept for 1 command point allows you to use either Awaken the Machine, Machine Focus or Master of Machines one more time. Master of Machines is vehicle healing. Awaken the Machine is the new Engine Seer buff to allow one vehicle to get +1 to hit. That means you can make 2 vehicles hit on 2s. And Machine Focus is shooting while doing an action, the new Technoarchaeologist buff, which we'll come to later. Best used if you just want a little bit more healing or 2 vehicles hitting on 2s, I guess. We have Machine Spirit Resurgent returning, allowing a vehicle to fight on full profile. For 2 command points we have Data Blessed Auto Sermon, a slightly pricey option to allow one unit within 6 inches of a Tech Priest to gain another unused Canticle ability this turn. So that's one that hasn't already happened at some point in the battle. Maybe say if you had a melee unit that really wanted +1 strength, maybe I guess that could be used for that. The requisition stratagems are the ones that allow you extra Warlord Traits and Relics. Archaeotech Specialist is your usual extra Relics one, you get to use it twice in Strike Force. And Mechanicus Locum is your extra Warlord Traits, again you can use it twice in Strike Force. We also have the ability to put extra Relics and Warlord Traits on Skitarii Alphas or Princeps. Say for example you could have a Cerberus Alpha or a Vanguard Alpha get a Warlord Trait or a Relic, but they have to be the Skitarii Warlord Traits or one of this selection of Relics. There are some pretty nice options here though, such as Temper Corpia to allow one unit to fight last, or things like giving one unit automatic cover. I feel like Admech armies might make very good use of these. It's going to be quite tempting to spend a fair few command points on these stratagems before the game even begins. Next up we come to strategic play, 1 command point for Binaric Override. That's the good old trusty one to change your Castellan robots protocols, but then they're locked in the one that they change to for the rest of the game. Next we have Acquisition at any cost. 1 command point to do auto-pass morale tests for any units within 6 inches of one nominated objective. That's actually really quite handy. In 9th edition also passes cost 2 command points, so having it available for 1 and on multiple units is amazing. It's likely to make leadership even more meaningless for Admech armies. 1 CP we have Machine Spirit's Vengeance, that allows you to auto-explode a vehicle. Could be pretty powerful in the right circumstances, such as say something like a Fuselage showering enemy units nearby with mortal wounds. For 1 CP we have Circuitous Assassins, that's the one that allows you to take a Skitarian unit off the edge of the board. They have to be within 9 inches, and then they return at the end of your next movement phase. Unlike before, they do have to spend a turn off the board. I think that isn't going to be used quite as much. I suppose in theory could still do some outflanking goodness. For 1 CP, Deeply Sunk Talons comes back. That's the 2+ you can't fall back against Taraxi Sterilizers. Certainly could be annoying if the enemy wants to shoot them to death. For 2 command points, Tactica Obliqua also comes back, a stratagem that I thought might not come back in the new Admech Codex, just because of how silly it is. To my surprise, Tactica Obliqua is almost unchanged. It's the one that allows your Cerberus Raiders to run away 12 inches when they do get charged by an enemy unit. It means that charge is almost guaranteed to fail unless there's some terrain in the way, and it really can mess up enemy melee armies, as you can scream with the Raiders and then run the horses away. It is a little bit nerfed now. The enemy can now redeclare their charge and declare against something else, but that's still not going to help them much if the Cerberus were all the way out the front of the army, and the enemy doesn't have anything else to charge anyway. Still very powerful, and it's a big boon to Cerberus. Next for 1 command point we have Crushing Weight. If you charge with Iron Striders, Dragoons or Castellans, you get a 2+ for a mortal wound for everyone that makes it into engagement range. Kind of okay but not outstanding. Electroshocked for 1 command point is pretty outstanding though. At the start of your fight phase you select 1 enemy unit that's not a vehicle or monster, and it has to be within engagement range of a Cult Mechanicus core unit or a Cult Mechanicus character. Core units are generally just the Electro Priests and occasionally the Castellan robots. That unit then fights last that phase, meaning that you might have the potential to hit them before they even get to hit you and maybe kill them first. Really quite nice, and if you've got some melee threat in yourself, it could make a heroic intervention Tech Priest actually genuinely quite annoying. This ability is just really nice on Electro Priests though. It means that they can charge into a unit and not have to worry about the opponent interrupting, as they can stop them from doing that with this stratagem. Finally, and for 1 command point, perhaps the most broken stratagem in the book, we have Booster Thrust for the Taraxi. I think that Games Workshop have messed up a bit on this one. Basically you have a Taraxi unit at the end of your turn, you get to jump it off the board, and it comes back in the next reinforcement phase. The thing is, it doesn't stop you from doing the exact same stratagem the next turn. So theoretically, if you had a few command points to burn, you could take a max unit of Sterilizers, deep strike them at the enemy, flame away with a bunch of hefty flamer damage, and then pop back into reserve with this stratagem every single turn. Basically, you could have invincible sterilizers, as they won't ever be on the board on the turn when your opponent's actually going to be playing. I'm pretty sure that's not the intent. I would be very surprised if this doesn't get FAQs. Finally, we have war gear stratagems, and there's some really quite nice ones in this section. For 1 command point, we have Seismic Bomb. That's the one for the fuselage, halving the enemy move and advance. A really useful bit of utility that makes the plane really annoying, and I'm quite glad that that one stays. Next, we have Chain Taser Protocols. This gives taser weapons an extra 2 hits on 5s as well as 6s. That will significantly amp up the melee for Dragoons or Skitarii Infiltrators. In normal circumstances, that's just going to be a flat 25% buff to your combat, often going to be worth it if you're charging in with a big unit. For 2 command points, Infoslave Skull is a 12-inch intercept style shooting. You can use it on any core unit. When the enemy sets up from reserve within 12 inches of you, you get to shoot at them. There's no -1 to hit or anything. Could even be quite intimidating on standard Skitarii Rangers at the moment with the amount of shots that they can put out. For 2 command points, we have Electrofilament Countermeasures. That's the Archaeopter one to turn off enemy auras, and unfortunately it is quite nerfed. It used to be 1 CP before, and it used to have a massive aura of itself where you couldn't use enemy auras in, but now it's 2 command points, and you can only turn off enemy auras to 1 unit within 6 inches of the plane. It does mean that you can't just move away from the plane and get your auras back though now. So if your opponent's got one big synergy unit with loads of stacked buffs, this could still potentially be worth the 2 command points and throw a massive spanner in the works. Next we have the Arc Grenade Stratagem, 1 command point for a 6-inch attack when you're within 6 inches of a vehicle. On a 2 to 5 it's D3 mortal wounds, and on a 6 it's 2D3. This rather unfortunately replaced the Tyraxi Skystalker's swoop attacks. They don't get to make a mortal wound attack on the flyby anymore. For 1 command point we have Incense Exhaust, -1 to hit on a smokescreen unit. That can be on a Jejune Crawlers or potentially the Transvectors and Archaeopters, provided you take a chaff launcher. Then we have 2 very interesting buffs indeed, Enriched Rounds and Galvanic Volley Fire, both of which buff the Vanguard and Rangers. Enriched Rounds for 1 command point is the Vanguard one. It makes radiant weapons wound all non-vehicle models on a 4+. That's really not bad on the sheer amount of shots that you can put out with these guys, as it basically counteracts the measly strength of 3. Say if you did go all in, had 20 Vanguard for 160 points, that Vanguard unit should be able to stack 25 wounds on any non-vehicle, even with just their auto wounding on 6s and their 4+ to wound on this stratagem. That's going to leave a mark on anything, no matter what your save is. Pretty scary when that's a completely unbuffed unit, and there's lots and lots of ways to get buffs on them. The one for the Rangers gives them some really nasty fire up close, 2 command points for Galvanic Volley Fire. The Rangers' Galvanic Rifles are currently Heavy 2, Strength 4, AP -1. This changes them from Heavy 2 to being Rapid Fire 2. Even if you're moving, it means that you just won't be able to take the heavy weapon penalty, so even then it could be a 33% increase to the damage output. But if you happen to be up close and personal with the enemy within 15 inches, then you're basically just getting double the shots. Again, theoretically, a 20-man unit within 15-inch range, that's putting out a staggering 80 Strength 4 AP -1 shots, which is just pretty insane damage output for those points. It is a little bit spendy at 2 command points, but seems very good. Finally, we have Overloaded Systems, which is an interesting one for an arc weapon. If you injure the vehicle with an arc weapon, then the vehicle counts as having half the amount of wounds available for any vehicle damage tables that they might have. Usually that's going to have the effect of putting them down a bracket, so maybe if they were hitting on 3s, they might be hitting on 4s after this. It costs 2 command points if you put it on a Titanic unit. I imagine that that could be really quite annoying and potent though on something like an Imperial Knight. Overall, loads of stratagems with massive value. I quite like +1 strength for 1 command point. The Auto Pass Morale one I'm sure will be useful. I still think Auto Exploding Vehicles is great value. Tactica Obliqua remains outstanding even at 2 command points and the nerf. Electroshock will really help you control the fight phase. Booster Thrust is kind of broken for the sterilizers, and to be honest most of the War Gear ones seem very good indeed. I really like the ones for the Rangers and Vanguard. I think the Admech are really going to be spoilt for choice for how to spend their command points. Moving on, let's take a look at the Relics, and these are the generic ones available to all Forge Worlds. First we have the Uncreator Gauntlet, a relic power fist that would have to go on the Datasmith. Its strength ×2, AP -3 and damage 3, no -1 to hit, gives you 1 extra attack, and every time it hits a vehicle, regardless of whether or not you wound it, you also score 1 mortal wound. It's fun, and on the raw stats alone it's really outstanding, but you have to put it on a model that only has 2 attacks, or 3 with this, and that model's mainly going to be a buff model. I just think that there are likely going to be better choices. The raiment of the Technomartyrs, an interesting combination of durability and buff. You get a 5+ feel no pain for the character, and 1 core unit within 3 inches will ignore hit roll modifiers. That could be pretty useful for, say, rangers moving and shooting with their galvanic rifles, or anything advancing and shooting. The durability buff on the character is just added bonus. The Skull of Elder Nicola gives you a bit of damage against enemy vehicles if you can get up at close and personal. In the shooting phase, every vehicle within 12 inches will take a few mortal wounds. You roll a dice for each unit. On a 2 or 3 they take 1, a 4 or 5 they take D3, and on a 6 they take 3 mortal wounds. Could be pretty horrifying when put on a Skitarii Raider Alpha perhaps if you are against loads of vehicles. You do kind of have to gamble on that being the case though. Next we have Purgation's Purity. This is a relic for the Skitarii Marshall's useless pistol. It actually makes it have a bit of a bite. At 24 inches, Assault 3, Strength 4, AP-2, Damage 2, and it auto wounds enemies on a 4+. Not too much to say about this one. It will chip away at a little bit of damage across the game, but not particularly outstanding. Maybe a model or 2 extra dead that wouldn't have been. Much better for the Skitarii Marshall is the Exemplar's Eternity. Perhaps one of the best relics here, as it doubles down on his buff ability to Skitarii units. The Marshals can usually allow you to reroll wounds to wound with nearby Skitarii core units. This allows rerolls of both hits and wounds of 1. Crazily efficient buffing character for just 45 points. This one's going to crop up in quite a lot of lists, I think. Next we have the Phos Phoenix, the relic Phosphor Serpenter. 18 inches, Assault 3, Strength 5, AP-2, Damage 2, ignores cover, and if you hit an enemy unit, then it exposes dense cover for nearby core units to the model that fired it. Again, not awful, but not enormously outstanding compared with buffing the excellent Skitarii shooting units we already have. Pater Cogtooth can make a priest a little bit more fighty, Strength +3, AP-2, and Damage 3. Not too bad against things like Gravis Armor if the Tech Priest can take the damage in return. Antion's Pseudogenitor is sort of like some relic Mechadendrites. The model that has it gets quite a big extra 3d3 attacks each turn at Strength +2, AP-1, and Damage 1. Could make a minor character legitimately annoying to face with hordes. Next we have the Omniscient Mask. Skitarii core units within 6 inches get exploding 6s in melee. I think that could be really nice when paired with Rust Stalkers perhaps. Usually that will amount to a plus 25% buff, which is very nice indeed for an extra relic. The Sonic Reaper is a Tech Priest Manipulus relic. His Transionic Cannon Flamer attack is bumped up to 12-inch range, Strength 5, AP-2, and Damage 2, and any wound rolls of 5 to 6 cause 2 mortal wounds. Pretty close range, but not a lot's going to want to get hit by it. The Tempercorpia is another quite simple and effective one. One enemy unit within 3 inches will fight last. Again, could be quite an interesting option for an alpha of some sort, rather than trying to get your Tech Priest mixed up in melee. Finally, the Cage of Varademus. This one allows that if you hit an enemy unit in melee, they get -1 to hit for the rest of the phase. It does rely on your model going first, so maybe it is only good if you've charged yourself. Overall, I think that most of the melee upgrades are probably going to get overlooked. They're quite fun, but Tech Priests just aren't really all that effective in melee. They're far more designed to be buffing characters than combat heroes. On the other hand though, a lot of the buffing ones could be very handy indeed. The raiment of the Technomartyr looks great on anything with Advance or with the Skitarii Rangers. Exemplar's Eternity is going to be really common to be picked for the Marshal. Both the Omniscient Mask and the Tempercopia, both are solid picks for buffing a Skitarii combat unit. Next up we come to the Warlord Traits, and for the generic ones there are 12, 6 for the Tech Priests and 6 for the Skitarii. The Tech Priest traits have a little bit of variety. The Skitarii units are all buffing ones that affect a single core unit. For the Tech Priest traits we have Emotionless Clarity, that allows one core Cult Mechanicus unit within 6 inches to fall back and charge. So that's going to be Electro Priests or Castellans that have a Data Smith nearby. Seems a bit on the niche side to me, to be honest. Masterwork Bionics give you a 4+ invul and -1 damage. Core gets this if he happens to be your Warlord. To be honest, it's really quite a good defensive buff on any character though, including a Tech Priest Dominus if you really want to keep him alive. First hand field testing gives you +1 strength and +1 damage to any one non-relic weapon. I'm going to say that this might be most interesting on a Tech Priest Dominus's Eradication array. Almost nothing else has really quite comparable strength, AP and damage. Still though, I don't think it's a particularly strong pick. Necromechanic makes the repairs a little bit better. You heal 3 wounds with it rather than D3, and it's quite nice that you could double down on the repairs like this, heal 2 different vehicles 3 wounds by using that stratagem Tech Adept. Potentially could be handy in the middle of a vehicle gun line perhaps. Cartogrammatist is basically an Electro Priest Deep Strike trait. Basically 1 core Cult Mechanicus unit gains Deep Strike. Maybe could be most handy for jumping out a big unit of Skitarii Priests and then just utterly roasting the enemy with tons and tons of lightning fire. Though I suppose maybe if you're Riser, you could go for a risky long charge with the Fulgurite Priests, maybe trying to coordinate with the Canticle that gives you extra charge range. To be honest, for 1 command point to buy this one in, it could be handy. And finally we have Supervisory Radiance. This gives 1 Cult Mechanicus core unit within 9 inches reroll hits in melee. A very nice buff this one. Again, it's either going to be Electro Priests or Castellan robots, both of which would very much thank you for this buff. Out of these, most of them feel sort of kind of useful, though not enormously outstanding. Depending on the situation, the durability, the healing, the Electro Priest Deep Strike and the rerolls all seem potentially useful. Moving on, we come to the Skitarii traits. I quite like the way that these work, to be honest. They apply to 1 Skitarii core unit within 9 inches, or 1 unit that's anywhere on the board if it has the data tether keyword. I quite like the idea of them transmitting orders through the radio. As we said in the stratagems, you can give one of these to an Alpha or Princeps for 1 command point, so it can be quite nice to have a unit that's built in buffing itself. The buffs are generally quite simple. Multitasking Cortex gives you shooting while doing an action, kind of passable in my opinion. Battle Link Sphere gives you no penalties for moving with heavy weapons or advancing with assault weapons. It's useful for most Skitarii this. Rangers, Vanguards, Cerberus Raiders and Iron Striders will all thank you. Programmed Retreat allows you to fall back and shoot. Some nice insurance if you are taking some really big blocks of Rangers or Vanguard. Archived Engagements gives you a fight first ability, maybe a bit more passable in my opinion. Firepoint Telemetry carded gives you light cover or +1 to save if your infantry is already in cover. Again, a solid durability upgrade, and quite nice that you could broadcast it all over the board. Seems pretty nice on things like Iron Striders or Dragoons. Finally, we have Eyes of the Omnissiah. This allows you to reroll advance and charge rolls. Again, another nice buff that you can use to try and get melee units into combat. I'd still be eyeing up Rust Stalkers for this. I think that lots of these are very usable indeed from the Skitarii Warlord Traits. I think my favourites will be Battle Link Sphere for the no penalties, Program Retreat to fall back and shoot, and the light cover one for a durability boost to 1 unit each turn. I would bear in mind though for these Skitarii Warlord traits, they will either have to be on that Skitarii Marshall or on an Alpha or Princeps. The Tech Priests themselves can't take these. As if this weren't already enough layered buffs to put on the army, we now come to the Holy Order abilities. Previously, in Engine War, they were Warlord traits that allowed you to pick 1 of 3 buffs per turn, though they now work pretty differently. Each of these is a paid for in points upgrade. They cost between 25 and 35 points, and you can upgrade any flavour of Tech Priest to take any one of the Holy Order traits. It appears that there's no limitation on how many of these buffs that you can put into place. You could have 4 different Tech Priests with 4 different Holy Order traits if you wanted to. Each Holy Order ability has 3 different parts. First up, you get a command point discount on 1 flavour of stratagem. Say for example the first time an army with a Genitor in it uses a battle tactic stratagem, that stratagem will cost 1 command point less. Just a once per game ability should translate into you getting 1 command point for free. Other than that though, your model also gets a buffing ability of some sort. It starts out with an initial part which you can use right from the get-go and keep all game if you want to, but there's also an advanced buffing part as well. If you spend an entire turn doing an action, which you have to do right from the start of the command phase, and it ends at the start of the next command phase, then you lose your initial part, but you gain the advanced part, so you swap the one for the other, you don't get both. While you're doing the action, the character wouldn't be able to do any movement or use any of their aura abilities, but they would still be able to apply their initial part action as that's done in the command phase. In any case, let's go through them and see what we've got. Upgrading to a Genitor costs 25 points, that will discount your battle tactic stratagem, and the initial part is 1 core or Cataphren unit. When it attacks in melee, any hit rolls of 6 will auto wound the enemy. Pretty handy on anything with a flurry of low strength attacks. Not a bad melee buff, though not enormously standout either. The advanced part means that 1 Cataphren or Servitor unit within 6 inches will gain a 6+ feel no pain. Quite annoying not to be able to have this on the first battle round, as that might be when you're taking some damage straight away, but from then on it'll be a small defensive buff. I don't really think that this one's the strongest one, to be honest. Both parts of it are kind of only usable but not particularly outstanding, even in ideal circumstances. Next up we have the Logi. This one's a bit pricier at 35 points, and it discounts a strategic play stratagem. The initial part is really quite a solid defensive buff. One core unit within 6 inches will ignore any AP if it's AP -1 or AP -2. It could make things like Dragoons or Iron Striders just completely laugh off things like autocannon or missile launcher fire. The advanced part allows you one core or Cataphrone units within 6 inches to ignore cover with its ranged attacks. For me, I'd be planning to use the initial part rather than the advanced one here, though I suppose you could always potentially flex it out if you did want to ignore cover, if you did have some enemy targets where that was going to be really meaningful. Still though, against the right opponent, that defensive buff could be very strong indeed. Next up we have the Magi, that's 30 points, and this one discounts an Epic Deed stratagem. The initial part I think is a bit underwhelming. It's just +2 inches to the advances of one core unit within 6 inches. I don't think it's very strong, but it does have the advantage of making one unit's movement a little bit quicker on turn 1, which is kind of meaningful, and you will get a bit of utility out of it. However, I think that the real winner with this one is the advanced part. It's basically a great shooting buff. One core unit within 6 inches will get exploding 6s when it shoots, so every successful hit roll of a 6 will generate an extra hit. It's an extra 25% shooting buff. Should be brutal with things like the core troops or with Iron Striders. I could most certainly see this one being taken, another powerful character buff for just 30 points. Next we have the Artisans for 25 points. This discounts a War Gear stratagem. Should be easy to get the command points back on that one, there's loads of really good ones. The initial part is pretty useful. It allows one core or Cataphrone unit within 6 inches to fall back and shoot, or also fall back and charge. If it shoots though, it will be at -1 to hit. Quite a nice insurance tool, that one. Really pretty handy for Iron Striders or Cataphrone Destroyers perhaps. Could give you a lot of insurance against getting them tagged in melee. Their advanced buff though is really good as well. This will give one core unit +1 strength to any ranged weapons. Again, a potentially really potent shooting buff depending on what target you're firing at. Lots of options come to mind from this one. Things like Vanguard going to strength 4, pretty terrifying on the amount of shots they can put out. Rangers with those galvanic carbines going to strength 5 AP -1. That's going to become a legitimate threat to anything and absolutely murder things that are toughness 4. Or maybe again with the Iron Striders, make those autocannons into strength 8 monsters. Again, another really good one. Both bits seem quite usable, and straight buffs to shooting are rarely going to be a bad thing. Out of these, I'd probably say my favourites are the Magi and the Artisans. Both their initial parts are kind of useful, and their advanced parts are both powerful shooting buffs, and potentially you could even layer them on the same unit. Just in terms of list building, perhaps the only sad thing is that you can't take these on the Skitarii Marshall, as he would be quite a good place to bear them. It means that you're going to have to find a job for a tech priest within the list, who often want to be hanging around vehicles more than core units, but I suppose that overlaps quite nicely on Iron Striders, which I seem to be talking about all the time with these buffs, as perhaps the scariest core unit with shooting. So now let's get on to all the Forge Worlds. There's 7 big ones to choose from. They each get their own Dogma, Warlord Trait, Relic and Stratagem, and there's also the option for a few custom Forge Worlds, where you can combine your choice of 2 traits. The Mars Dogma looks like a particularly powerful one. It allows your Skitarii to gain Canticles of the Omnissiah, which means that rather than having one set of army-wide buffs, they're going to get 2. Between the combinations of Shroud, Psalm and Bulwark, you could have a crazily durable army for a turn, or combining +1 to hit with all those rerolls, you're going to get a crazy amount of shooting. It doesn't end there though, because also every single time a Mars unit shoots, you can also reroll 1 hit roll per unit. A nice little additional amp up of every single firepower that you have in your army. Their Warlord Trait's potentially quite useful as well. It allows you to basically select a Canticle for one unit that's within 6 inches of the Warlord, and then both your Warlord and that unit gets it. It does have to be a Cult Mechanicus unit though, as opposed to a Skitarii one. Maybe it could be quite nice to keep a unit of Cataphrone Destroyers perhaps, either in Shroud, Psalm or Benediction of the Omnissiah, for a little bit more defense or damage. I think their relic, the Red Axe, might be the single best way to try and make a fighty tech priest in the book. It gives you strength +2, AP -5 and damage 2, and perhaps most importantly, +3 attacks. Even something like a Dominus is going to be really quite threatening with that about. Finally, their stratagem, the Wrath of Mars, for either 1 or 2 command points, is the one where you get mortal wounds on the wound roll of a 6. It costs 1 command point if you're less than 11 power, or 2 command point if the power level of your unit is 11 or more. It is capped at a maximum of 6 mortal wounds now, so no more doing like 12 mortal wounds like we used to be able to with Castellan robots. But there are really loads of good choices for this now. Standard Rangers or Vanguard, or maybe Skystalkers or Infiltrators with all that flechette fire. Overall, Mars seems really strong to me. Their Dogma's amazing, their Warlord Trait and Relic are both very usable indeed, and Wrath of Mars gets you a bunch of extra mortal wounds, rarely going to be a bad thing. Next we have Lucius. Their Dogma makes their infantry a bit tougher, +1 save against damage 1 weapons, and on top of that you get an extra +3 inch range to all the weapons in the Admech Codex. Potentially that's pretty cool on anything that's quite close range, say things like Sulphur Hound, Sulphur Breath, or the Phosphor Torches of the Sterilizers. Certainly wouldn't hurt to have 15 inch range on them. Their traits are defensive buff as well. 1 core unit within 9 inches can only ever be wounded on a 4+. Could be pretty handy on Castellan robots or Iron Striders, or just any infantry in general really. Their relic, the Soul of Flare, means that the bearer and 1 core unit can teleport across the board. It's basically the Admech Veil of Darkness for the Necrons, and that could be a good way of delivering a close range shooting threat right into enemy lines. To be honest though, I think that would be more handy in virtually any other Forge world, as you can already teleport stuff around in Lucius, as for 1 command point you've got the Legio Teleportarium. For a command point each, you can deep strike any non-vehicle unit and use the stratagem twice in a Strike Force game. Again, Lucius sounds pretty all-round solid to me. I think its strength is mainly going to be with anything that's close range, things that need to get delivered by teleporters or will benefit from the +3 inch range, and could be particularly quite handy for infantry with that +1 save against damage 1. Agrippinar is the next Forge world, and their Dogma is also another close range shooty one. The AP of their weapons gets AP -1 better whenever they're within half range of their target for shooting. Probably best on anything with either really long range or very low AP. Skitarii Vanguard would really love an extra AP -1 on their radium, and could be nice on things like Iron Striders with autocannons to overcome the AP -1. In addition, they can also hold steady or set to defend for either +1 to hit when they get charged, or 5+ Overwatch if they choose to pay the stratagem. Their Warlord trait allows you to select 1 core unit within 6 inches. Whenever a model dies, you roll a 4+. If you pass, then they get to shoot or make a single melee attack. It's okay, but a bit passable for me. A bit of extra nice shooting, but it doesn't rely on your opponent killing your unit in the way that you want them to. Their relic is the Eye of Xylexum. It allows core units or cataphrons within 6 inches to re-roll wounds against a selected vehicle that's within 18 inches. Potentially powerful close range shooting against that one vehicle, but maybe just a little bit annoying to set up. Finally, their stratagem for 1 command point is Indentured Machines. You can use this up to twice in Strike Force games, and it makes a unit of Cataphron Breaches or Destroyers toughness 6. A small buff this one is going to be really meaningful against anything that's strength 5 or strength 6, but that's only a fairly small subset of weapons. Overall, I'd say maybe Agrippinar's just a little bit weaker. I think their Dogma's fairly strong with the extra AP, but the other bits just aren't really quite as overwhelming. Moving on, we come to Graia with their refusal to yield, and I think their Dogma might be the worst out of any of them unfortunately. They auto-pass combat attrition and get a 5+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, both things that really might not come up all that much in any one game. Their trait, however, is thoroughly annoying, and it's a really good one. It allows 1 unit within 9 inches of the Warlord to heroically intervene a massive 6 inches in the enemy fight phase. If you're surrounded by a few fighty core units, things maybe like Sindonian Dragoons perhaps, or other melee like Electro Priests or Ross Stalkers, that could give you a pretty crazy threat range for enemy units not being able to go anywhere near you unless they want to be in melee. Really powerful this, and I think it might be one of the best draws to actually play Graia. Their relic is the Cerebral Technomiter. It gives you +3 inches to aura abilities, perhaps pretty handy on a Tech Priest Dominus. And finally, their stratagem is kind of handy. 1 command point for Steel Mind Iron Logic. Within 18 inches, if the enemy manifests a psychic power, they deny it on a 4+, one of the only psychic denial options in the entire book. Overall, I'm not the most convinced about Graia. I think their Dogma is just a bit of a miss, but that Warlord trait looks really quite powerful. Next we have Styges 8, the stealthy infiltrating Admech. Their Dogma gives standard vehicles getting dense cover greater than 18 inches away from the enemy, so -1 to hit, and all other units, core vehicles and anything else in the Codex will be -1 to hit anywhere that's greater than 12 inches away. In addition, when they charge, enemies can't hold steady and can't set to defend. As ever, Stygies are just going to be a lot harder to shift with enemy shooting, particularly if you combine this with things like Shroud Psalm or Bulwark Protocol. Their trait's also very good. It allows you to redeploy 2 Stygies 8 units or put them into strategic reserve for free. Very nice this one, as it helps give you a first turn advantage. You can hide units if your opponent has first turn, or you can put them in optimal strike position if you do. I don't really like their relic though. The Omniscience Hand is a once per game attack. It gives a 12-inch aura where you roll a dice. On a 2 to 5, anything within 12 inches takes a single mortal wound. On a 6, they take D3. A bit on the rubbish side unless you're literally right in the heart of the enemy army. Finally though, their stratagem is quite interesting. Clandestine Infiltration is pretty good on 1 core infantry unit, and it can be set up anywhere that's 9 inches away from enemy models and the enemy deployment zone. Potentially good for something like Electro Priests or Rust Stalkers starting in the midfield, or even just a big unit of Rangers or Vanguard to hold back the enemy. Overall, I'd say that Stygies is another very solid one. Extra durability against shooting is pretty nice, and the Warlord Trait and Stratagem will make sure that you're optimally deployed for first turn. Next up we come to Riser, the Admech who seem to have succumbed to the Black Rage and appear to be Blood Angels. Their dogma is just very similar to the Blood Angel Space Marine one, giving them +1 to their charge and +1 to their wound roll on the first round of melee. As it works for the Blood Angels, I'm sure it will work for these guys. Great extra reliability of getting charges off, and massive extra damage when you get there. It's particularly good for lower strength units really punching above their weight. Their traits are melee buff as well. 1 core unit within 6 inches gets a better melee AP by -1. Their relic is Weapon 99, a 24-inch heavy 3 Volkite blaster with strength 7, AP -2 and damage 2, and you get 2 mortal wounds on 6s. Quite a nice generalist profile there. That'll certainly put some hurt on anything that you point it at. Finally, their Plasma Specialist Stratagem has been nerfed. It's now 2 command points, and it gives you +1 damage on plasma weapons. Really, the only place that this is worth it is on a maxed out squad of Cataphron Destroyers. 6 of them with a big damage 3 plasma could be potentially very scary indeed. Overall, I think that Riser looks quite fun to play as, mainly for that dogma taking things like Rust Stalkers, Electro Priests, and maybe even Sindionian Dragoons to the next level of fighting melee. Finally, for the main Forge world, we come to Metallica. They of course have their entire Charadon supplement all to themselves, so have quite a lot of options both in terms of Warlord Traits, Relics and Stratagems. The ones from the book have had a shake-up though. Their dogma allows them to ignore the penalty for moving with assault weapons or heavy weapons for infantry, a buff that seems to keep on coming up and a pretty useful one within the new decks, and a slightly random and fairly useless little debuff to enemies, where if you're in melee with them, they count as half strength for the purposes of combat attrition. I guess if they fail a leadership test, might be a little bit more in terms of taking morale casualties. Their Warlord trait is quite a disruptive one. It means that 1 unit within 12 inches will be -1 to hit till the next command phase, and that's both in shooting and melee. So if you could put this on an expendable character to get close, and you put it on an enemy unit, you could really mess with their damage. Their relic is the Adamantium Arm. It's strength ×3, AP -4 and damage 4, but you only get a single attack at +1 to hit, and even then you might fail to wound. Not really sure it's quite worth it, to be honest. Finally, the Stratagem Deafening Assault is very good indeed. When you have a Metallica unit shooting, you nominate 1 enemy unit within 12 inches, and they get debuffed in 2 ways. They only get half their movement next turn, and they can't overwatch or set to defend. I could definitely see that being deployed by something like an Archaeopter as a big debuff, or even just when you're going to charge in with something and it's got potentially very powerful overwatch. Overall, I'd say their dogma's okay, though not absolutely amazing. Deafening Assault seems really good, though really I think that the main draw to them is still largely going to be the Charadon book. Overall, I think they've done well to draw people to most of these Forge worlds. Probably the ones that I think are most interesting are Mars, Lucius, Stygies, Riser and Metallica. I think maybe Graia and Agrippina just aren't quite on the same sort of level. Next, of course, we have the custom Forge worlds. These ones work in the exact same way as they did in Engine War. You just get a 2-part trait, no relics or warlord traits or anything. You get a primary bonus for each Forge world, and then you select one of 3 secondaries. A few of these are similar, but a lot of them just have similar names and have quite different abilities. The one that was amazing for Cataphrons with the exploding arc weapons on 5s and 6s is gone. To be honest, I was expecting it to be gone. Giving a +60% buff to shooting on every unit that used it was pretty crazy. First up, we have the Rad Saturated one. This means that ranged attacks against core units are -1 strength if the enemy is greater than 12 inches away. Quite a nice little debuff this. It's not going to come into effect every time the enemy shoots at anything. but on certain units, say maybe firing against Iron Striders with strength 6 or 7 weapons, that'll be really quite nasty. Then you have the choice of 3, one making rad saturation 3-inch range, allowing your vanguard to make the enemy units -1 strength and toughness even when they're not in combat. That's potentially powerful, particularly when you're shooting them. And just to note, in this new book, rad saturation is now -1 strength and toughness, so say if your opponent charges some vanguard, they won't be hitting them quite as hard. The next one's a radiant weapon buff if you want to spam vanguard for days. It makes them +1 strength and AP better by 1, and honestly that's strong enough a buff that I think it actually could be worth building around. 20 vanguard for 160 points is 60 shots at strength 4 AP -1 in this, and reasonable threat range after advancing as well. Very, very scary. Finally, the last one is ignore combat attrition modifiers, which I'd say is quite skippable. Next up we have Expansionists, which makes your AP -1 better in the first round of melee. May be good for any of your melee units with relatively low AP, and it could actually allow things like basic Skitarii even to punch above their weight. I'm not sure it's really going to compete with Riser though for a pure melee Skitarii list. The other buffs are kind of interesting though. The first one gives Skitarii core units a 3-inch pre-game move, so a tiny little bit of positioning shuffling there. The next gives +6-inch range to rifle and carbine weapons. Again, could be interesting on Vanguard, they could be firing 24 inches with that. And there's yet another one where the infantry don't get any heavy weapons or assault weapon penalty when they advance. For me, this one's just trying to do a couple of different things at the same time. If you want melee, it's not going to be quite as strong as Riser. If you want buffs to Rangers or Vanguard, I think that other Forge Worlds do it better. There's just not all that much overlap between these two buffs. Next we have the Data Horde Forge World. This keeps it 6-up Feel No Pain on vehicles, which is pretty handy. Then there's +2-inch movement to Cataphrons or Dune Crawlers, not very good I think. A nice regenerative one for vehicles, where they heal 1 wounds and counters double wounds remaining for the vehicle damage table. Compound that with a Feel No Pain and you've got quite a good vehicle detachment there. They're both harder to kill and regrow wounds when they get shot. And finally there's quite a powerful offensive damage one, which is reroll hit rolls with Cognis weapons when you're within half range. That's potentially really quite a nice buff on things like Iron Striders or Strataraptors. I think there's 2 good choices there. 6-up Feel No Pain vehicles, either with healing or with built-in extra damage if you're using loads of Cognis weapons. Finally we have a new addition in the Reignited Forge Worlds. This one's a ranged buff to core units where their attacks are AP -1 better on hit rolls of 6s. This one's a small but quite generalist buff. It's going to be applicable on quite a wide range of units, a small but meaningful damage increase. Their 3 traits to choose from are enemy melee attacks are AP -1 worse if they made a charge move or heroic intervention, so basically a little bit of toughness for your own guys in melee, +3 inches for all your aura abilities aside from rad saturation up to a 9-inch max, and a melee damage buff where if you're targeting something with a 3+ save or better, you get an extra pip of AP -1 in melee. Seems quite a good generalist one there. I think maybe one that you could play around with if you're using absolutely tons of core units. Out of these, I think that Rad Saturated is really quite powerful, both the longer range Rad Saturation and the boosted Vanguard. Data Horde's interesting for some vehicle related detachments, and Reignited is generally okay, but maybe not absolutely standout. Finally, there is just one option for slaved systems. They basically just copy the dogmas of the main Forge Worlds, and I think there's no actual reason to use them aside from just being fluffy. You may as well just run the army as Riser or Metallica for example, as then you get access to the full options rather than a slightly cut down version of them that you get with the slave systems options. As with all the new codexes, the Admech have their own unique secondary objectives, and as normal you can only use one of these, and if your Warlord's Admech, basically to stop your Warlord being an Imperial agent such as an Inquisitor. I wouldn't say that any of the secondaries are auto picks. Accretion of Knowledge is a Purge the Enemy one. You get 3 victory points for each dead enemy with a Warlord trait, Relic, or is a vehicle with 14 or more wounds. Usually not going to be one to take, maybe in weird armies that both have plenty of those vehicles and a fair few characters bearing relics, it could be worth it. Next we have Uncharted Sequencing, a Battlefield Supremacy one, where you nominate an objective for every battle round at the start of the game, and then if you control it at the end of each battle round, then you get the points. I think that one's an absolutely massive swing as to whether you go first or second. If you go first, then it could actually be really quite hard. It means your opponent has an entire turn to shoot you off that objective and stop you scoring the points. I guess in theory could net a fair few points for your home field objectives and the midfield ones, though I think you'd really want to pile an absolute ton of stuff on each sequenced objective each turn. Next up we have Hidden Archaeovault, which is a Battlefield Supremacy one. He nominates one objective to be a hidden Archaeovault. It has to be one in the midfield. You get 2 victory points for controlling it at the end of each battle round, or 5 victory points for controlling it at the end of the battle. I guess if you analyse the game at the start and you think that your opponent isn't going to be able to stop you taking the midfield, this one could be potentially useful, though it will wound up in a massive fight over that objective. Finally, we have Eradication of Flesh. This is a no mercy, no respite one. You need to have at least one vehicle on the table, and you need to kill more enemy infantry units than you lost in vehicle units that turn. If you do, then you get 3 victory points. I think that's potentially interesting. You'd have to have enough vehicles though to know that your opponent isn't just going to wipe them out, and I think you'd only ever want to take it if your opponent's got an absolute ton of chaff infantry units, so you could comfortably blow through 1 or 2 each battle round. Overall, I think that these are actually fairly balanced. I think the Games Workshop has done quite a good job with them, not to make any just auto takes like they managed with Oaths of Moment or some of the Dark Angels ones, but pretty much all of them could have a niche use depending on exactly what opposing army you're fighting. Now let's move on into the datasheets, and we're mainly going to focus on the points cost and the new changes. We'll start with the 2 new datasheets, the Skitarii Marshall here and the Technoarchaeologist, and then go through troops, HQs, elites, fast attack, heavy support, and the others. In any case, the Skitarii Marshall is a 45-point model. I did make an entire video about him, so feel free to check that out if you'd like. In any case, he's movement 6, weapon skill 3+, ballistic skill 2+, strength and toughness 3, 4 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 8, a 4+ save, and a 5+ invul with enhanced bionics. He's really no good in a fight himself. He's got a massively underwhelming pistol in that Radium Serpenter, assault 1, strength 3, and damage 1, where hits of 6 auto wounds like the standard radium guns, and he's got a control stave, a strength +3, AP -2, damage 1 melee weapon. Really, he's going to be taken to be an excellent buffing character, and he does that very well for 45 points. A 6-inch aura of all Skitarii core units, re-rolling 1s to wound either in shooting or melee, and he can nominate 1 Skitarii unit either within 9 inches or anywhere on the board if they have a data tether, and that unit will ignore the deprecation effect of any active Skitarii doctrines. I think even having 1 or 2 of these could be quite helpful for those. It means that you aren't going to be nerfing your own units while you're buffing some of the others. Finally, he's an infantry character. He is a Doctrina assembler, which means he can allow you to use those Doctrina imperatives, and he is Skitarii, so no Tech Priest keywords, which does lock him out of a fair few options. Overall, for a buffing character, this guy is insanely strong. I think he's usually going to be run with the Relic to allow reroll 1s to hit for Skitarii as well. So basically for 45 points you've got a reroll 1s to hit and wound buffing character who also helps out with the Doctrina imperatives, and could even take a buffing Warlord trait from the Skitarii ones on top of that. The other new datasheet is the Technoarchaeologist, basically Mr. Daedalus from Blackstone Fortress, reborn as a new generic character. Previously, Daedalus was quite a common pick, as he did give you +1 to hit for 1 unit nearby. I'm afraid that's gone. This one works quite differently. Some interesting bits, but I'm not necessarily sure he's stronger. The Technoarchaeologist will cost you 55 points or 3 power. He's a Cult Mechanicus Tech Priest infantry with a Doctrina assembler keyword. His stat line is very similar to the Engineer. 6-inch move, weapon skill 4+, ballistic skill 3+, strength and toughness 4, 4 wounds, 2 attacks, leadership 9 and a 3+ save, again protected by a 5+ invul from enhanced bionics. He has a little bit of shooting with his eradication pistol, that's D3 blast shots at strength 6, and it's got 2 modes, either focused when you're within 6-inch range, giving it AP -3 and damage 2, so quite potent really, or dispersed if you're a bit further away, 12-inch range, AP -2 and damage 1. He's also got a servo arc claw, basically a servo arm, but it gives you strength 7, AP -2 and damage 3, and it gets the arc special rules where it auto wounds vehicles on 4s, and it gets +1 damage versus vehicles. In general though, he's still not really a fighty character. He might just be able to chip away at a couple of things in close if it's safe to engage. Again, really you're going to be taking him for his abilities, and he has 3 useful ones. First up, like the Space Marine infiltrators, he packs an Omni Scrambler, which means that enemy units can't be set up as reinforcements anywhere within 12 inches of him. Now I'd say this perhaps isn't quite as big a deal on a fragile character like this guy. You're often not massively going to want to put him right on the front lines, but I think it could be quite interesting if he's trying to hold down an objective alongside a few other Skitarii. If you bunch them up close to him, it could mean that their charges are longer, or even if it's just him on the objective, they wouldn't be able to charge him at all. It could at least stop them from dropping too close to you. His other main buff is Machine Focus. It has 2 parts. First, Cataphrons can do actions like their infantry, as now they're technically bags, and when any unit that this is being used on does an action, you can still shoot while doing it. I guess say could be handy if you're holding down some objectives with a Cataphren unit. You want to do something like raise a banner or deploy scramblers and still get their firepower. I'd say it's alright, but you would just have to weigh it up against taking something like a very cheap Skitarii Ranger or Vanguard unit and just doing the action with them. I'm not sure it's really all that strong an ability, to be honest. Finally, like the rest of the Tech Priest, he also has Master of Machines, repairing any Forge World model D3 wounds when he's within 3 inches of it. It's interesting to note that both him and the engines here have a new Brotherhood of the Cog special rule. It means that if they're in the same detachment as a Dominus or Manipulus, they can be slotless, so you don't have to have a spare HQ slot for them. Overall, I think it's really quite a nice move that they did choose to put this guy in the Admech Codex. I honestly wasn't expecting it, but I don't think his datasheet is enormously strong either. For me, he perhaps might be the Tech Priest I'm least likely to pick compared with the others. Let's move on to the other datasheets in the Codex now, and we'll start with the troops. I think some of the enormous winners out of the Codex are the Rangers and Vanguard, both of which have dropped to 8 points per model, and both of which have got better. We saw the Rangers' new galvanic rifles previewed, their heavy 2 shots at 30 inches, strength 4, AP-1 and damage 1, which to be honest for an 8-point model is insanely good firepower. They're shooting just as hard as a Space Marine with bolter discipline, while costing less than half the cost. Also, as we've seen, there's a whole ton of ways that you can mitigate the -1 to hit from moving and shooting, things like Warlord Traits or certain Forge World dogmas. They also gained an innate small 3-inch pre-game move, so can do a little bit of shuffling right at the start of the game to get some optimal positions. And as I have alluded to a few times before in the preview, they can take units of up to 20 now. The same goes for the Vanguard. To me, say 20 of these with the galvanic rifles seems like a really good buy for 160 points. You'll be pinging out 40 quality anti-infantry shots per turn, and there's a crazy amount of ways to buff them and make them stronger. Their special weapons have got a bit more weird though. Both them and the Vanguard aren't anywhere near as flexible. If the squad's got 9 models or less, you can now only take 1 special weapon. If the squad's got 10 or more models in it, then it means that you can take 1 of each, so no doubling down on arc rifles if you want to. And if the squad has 20 models in it, then you can take up to 2 of each. A bit annoying reflection of which weapons only come in the box, rather than Games Workshop just being a bit more free with their assembly. In any case, all of the special weapons got small buffs. The arc rifle went up to 10 points, but is now 30-inch range, strength 6, AP-2 and damage D3, which is a profile that's going to be good against virtually anything. And the new arc special rule means it always wounds vehicles on a 4+, and it gets a flat damage 3 against vehicles. Seems like quite a decent buy for 10 points. Plasma calivers are also 10 points, remain assault 2, but it got a huge range boost to 30 inches. Could be handy for hidden in a ranger squad perhaps. And the transuranic arquebus can now move and fire, but it does cost 15 points. Otherwise it's unchanged, still remains a very powerful sniper weapon. Data tellers on the new datasheet grant +1 leadership, and the data teller tag, the one that allows, say, Skitarii Marshalls to order the unit about no matter where they are on the board, and they cost 5 points for most units that can take them. Finally, there's a small buff to their melee weapons, all of which got little bits of extra strength or AP here or there. Of course, they got some great stratagems as well. Being able to change those galvanic rifles to rapid fire too means that you do have the potential for 80 shots out of 1 unit. Pretty crazy. It's a similar story for Vanguard, to be honest. They got most of the above changes. Their radium carbines have now been tweaked a bit. They now get auto wound on hits of 6 rather than the 2 damage on 6s, and that only affects units that aren't vehicles. They seem very efficient for stacking a ton of AP0 wounds on near enough anything, particularly if you use that stratagem to wound anything on a 4+. Rad saturation has been buffed a bit. It now gives -1 strength and -1 toughness when they're within engagement range. Pretty handy, particularly in combination with a Skitarii melee unit. They don't get the pre-game move like the Rangers do, but otherwise they get all the same changes to special weapons and 20-man units as well. I think both of these are looking great alongside the Skitarii Marshall, both for some really cheap rerolls, and for putting other buffs from Relics or Warlord Traits on them. Next we have the other half of the troops, the Cataphren Breachers and Destroyers. Breachers are 35 points base, and Destroyers are 40. Interestingly, they are troops with OBSEC, but they aren't core units anymore. They seem to be very much gun platforms, and I think that they do get by on their own raw stats. They're still pretty strong for what they do. You used to be able to take them in units of up to 12, that size has been limited down to up to 6 max, so not quite as crazy efficiency as the stratagems that you could do before. But often I think it makes sense to run them in fairly small units anyway. You can get more rerolls from things like Beneficence of the Omnissiah. The last nerve is that they became bikers rather than infantry, but they can still move through walls and breachable terrain as if they were infantry. They're mainly just limited from going into top floor ruins now, which I guess makes sense on their massive heavy track units. Otherwise, the unit did pick up a fair few buffs. They now have a 2+ save, which is pretty crazy survivability on a 35-point model, particularly one with such heavy firepower. They're a little bit faster if they choose to advance. They're no longer just D3 move and advance, and as bikes they can still move and fire with heavy weapons, and they still have their 6+ bionic save. I'd say their shooting weapons saw small buffs, but their melee weapons got far scarier. The Arc Claw is now strength 6, AP -3 and damage 1, and you get +1 attack, and wound vehicles on 4 for a flat 2 damage against them. I think however that the Hydraulic Claw is now the way to go. It's strength 10, AP -2 and damage 3, and unlike before there's now no negative hit modifier with it. That is pretty scary when even just a small bare bones unit of breaches will be throwing out 9 strength 10, AP -2 attacks with damage 3. Heavy arc rifles are 36 inches heavy 2 weapons, strength 6, AP -2, damage 2. Again they get all those arc rules, so are going to be extra nasty against vehicles. And the torsion cannon's gone up a bit, it's now +10 points. Its range increased to 48, its strength 8, AP -4, and damage D3 +3. Much more of a dedicated anti-tank weapon, though still may be a bit painful on a ballistic skill 4 platform when you're going to miss half the time. The Destroyer's now 40 points, you pay an extra 10 for the Plasma Culverin, or an extra 5 for the Cognis Flamer, and they got all the basic unit changes as above. They're far more durable now with their 4+ armor save going to a 3+, so maybe a bit more well-rounded as opposed to being slight glass cannons. Their plasma weapons will only deal you 1 mortal wounds damage per overheat now, but that's still a bit of a trade-off against the fact that you can no longer get reroll 1s to hit with a handy nearby Tech Priest Dominus, as of course they aren't core, but they still seem like pretty efficient damage output for the points, particularly in Riser when you can make them damage 3. The Grav Cannons are unchanged and look fairly efficient. Cognis Flamers give you D6 +2 auto hits, and the Phosphor Blasters get the change for all Phosphor weapons where they now ignore dense cover, not light cover. Overall, I think that both of these guys are still very sturdy units for holding objectives, though without the crazy access to rerolls and things that they had, they're not going to be quite as strong on the damage dealing front. I think they've kind of changed from kill everything shooting units to having a bit of shooting with a bit more emphasis on their durability and melee damage in the case of the Cataphoron breaches. I think they still seem usable to me though, at least at first glance. Next we'll go through the HQ choices, starting with Belisarius Call himself, who does remain an HQ, picks up the Supreme Commander keyword, and drops from 200 points down to 180. He changes to the similar buffs seen by many Chapter Masters. He provides reroll 1s to hit on core units within 6 inches, no matter what Forge World they're in. He can nominate 1 Mars core unit to get 4 rerolls to hit, and he can swap the Canticle on a Cult Mechanicus core unit within 6 inches. Otherwise, Mr. Call is largely unchanged. His Solar Atomizer got a small buff, damage 3 or damage D3 +3 within half range, and both his melee weapon options got a minor buff compared with previously. I think he still seems very solid in Mars, giving 4 rerolls to 1 unit, but I'm not sure he's quite as much of an auto-include around a gunline list compared with his previous incarnation. Next we have the Manipulus, 70 points now, the Transonic Cannon being an extra 5. He'd had a small stat line boost, going up to Ballistic Skill 2+ and 5 wounds. Both his shooting weapons saw small buffs, the Magna Rail Lance is now flat damage 3 and a 36-inch range, and the Sonic Cannon, his boosted flamer, is now 12-inch range and also does mortal wounds on 6s. Most of the units got a small buff to their Omniscient Axes, his melee's gone to strength 7. Previously, you could choose between buffing units' movement or their shooting nearby. Unfortunately, the movement buff is completely gone. He is now very much a shooting buffing character. You get to choose 1 core unit within 6 inches, and it gains +6-inch range and AP -1 to any galvanic weapons, any arc weapons, or any radium weapons. Galvanic will be pretty potent on either the Cerberus Raiders or the Skitarii Rangers. The arc weapons are mainly going to be useful on any special weapons within the Ranger squad, and the radium buff will certainly be helpful for Skitarii Vanguards. I think that the Vanguard might be one of the best beneficiaries. An extra 6-inch range to 24 inches is great for the Radium Carbine, as is gaining a pip of AP to AP -1. That could be legitimately terrifying in the Forge World that gets the Radium weapons buff. That could give you a squad of Vanguard with 24-inch shooting, 60 shots at strength 4 AP -2, and also the auto wounding on 6s thing. I think the Manipulus could be a good choice if you're looking at running a Tech Priest along some infantry, maybe trying to get one of those Holy Orders on the go. The Dominus is 75 points, and if you upgrade to the Eradication Array or the Phosphor Serpenter, that's an extra 5 points each. He retains his reroll 1's aura to all core units, not just ones in the shooting phase as he had previously. Otherwise he's pretty similar. His melee is now strength 6 and his Volkite blaster is now damage 2. Overall though, I don't think that the Dominus is going to be taken all that much. For any Skitarii units you can use the Marshall for a damage buff, particularly with that relic. I think perhaps he might have his best use alongside Castellan robots which he can make core. Finally, for the HQ section, aside from the datasheets that we've already talked about, we have the Engineer. He used to be a 35 points very cheap character for bearing Warlord Traits and things. He's now actually gained a bit more of a function in that he's a dedicated vehicle buffer now. He'll grant +1 to hits for a non-Castellan Forge World vehicle within 3 inches, and he can potentially use that twice with the Tech Adept Stratagem. He still does his healing. He gains a 5+ invul save for his new bionics. His pistols buff considerably to 12 inches, 2 shots, strength 4, AP -2. Still not going to do much, but quite nice. And like the Technoarchaeologist, if you have a Dominus or a Manipulus in the detachment, you can include one of these guys without taking up an HQ slot. Basically, if you're looking to run a battery of vehicles, the Engineer seems like quite a good choice. Next, let's go for the Elite slot, though we'll leave the Cybernetica Datasmith to talk about alongside the Castellans. Servitors are now 28 points for a unit of 4, basically unchanged from previous. They don't get Forge World dogmas and are generally just a little bit rubbish. Probably best used for a very cheap chaff screening unit if you really need one. They are the cheapest unit that can do an action, though you would have to trade off between just getting a bare-bones squad of Skitarii Rangers or Vanguard, which are very cheap and will do a fair bit more than them once they're done with doing actions. Both the Fulgurites and the Skitarii Electro Priests are both 15 points a pop, and most of their datasheet does remain unchanged. The Fulgurite Priests, rather than having D3 damage and D3 mortal wounds on 6s, they're now just flat damage 2 and flat 2 mortal wounds. They still remain murderous melee beatsticks, but they're not quite as crazily tanky when they kill a unit anymore. Previously, they went up to a 3+ invul save, which certain Forge Worlds or certain Stratagems could buff to a 2+, but now when they kill a unit and drain its life energy, they now get +1 to their mortal wound impact hits for future charges, and their invul is only improved to a 4+, not a 3+. Still very hard hitting, but won't be quite as hard to remove once they've done their damage. It's worth noting that the Electro Priests are the only Cult Mechanicus core unit, so a lot of the buffs that we talked about in the Warlord Traits section are largely going to be revolving around them. The Skitarii Electro Priests went up to 15 points, but their AP0 gauntlets with strength 5 all have been buffed up to AP -1 now, making them a bit more of a generalist threat, but unfortunately they no longer have the stratagem that allows their shooting to go to AP -2, so a bit more damaging normally, but less damaging than if you'd had a CP spare to use the stratagem. The other buff that they got is that they now ignore any ballistic skill modifiers, so if they want to advance and use their close range shooting, they won't be taking any negatives to hit. And the Electro Priests do have a fair few fun stratagems and options. That Warlord trait to allow a unit to deep strike could be fun with the Skitarii, and of course that one to make an enemy unit fight last, which could be really handy for making sure that they don't get interrupted. Next we have the Sicarians at 17 points per model. Both the Infiltrators and Ruststalkers are this now, the Infiltrators going down a bit, the Ruststalkers going up a bit. Both units have acquired a 5+ invul save from enhanced bionics, so they're at least fairly survivable with their 2 wounds now. The Infiltrators are just a fair bit better than they were before. A 3-point discount is very nice. If you take their Taser Goads, they're now AP -1, so a bit more threatening. And they also picked up a pretty handy defensive special rule, which means that if any enemy unit attacks them and they're less than 12 inches away, they won't get any rerolls to hit or wounds. Should certainly help keep them a bit more safe in melee than they would be otherwise. Otherwise, they can still forward deploy just like previously, a much more efficient unit than they were before. Ruststalkers I think are also massively improved. The biggest deal is that they actually get lots of AP in melee now. Their Transionic Blades are strength +1, AP -3, and 6s will deal 1 mortal wound. I think that's largely going to be stronger than the Cord Claw and Razor. You'll get 1 additional attack with the Cord Claw at AP -1 only, but the Transionic Razor doesn't have quite as much AP or strength. As well as the weapon buffs, the Ruststalkers also got a couple of other handy things. They now ignore modifiers to movement, advance and charge rolls, aside from the Doctrina deprecations, and if they do happen to be benefiting from cover, they also get +1 to their armor save. Pretty nice for a Mars unit maybe, where you could get them cover with Shroud's Arm. Overall, I think that both units of Electro Priests still look very usable indeed. I'm maybe a little bit less sold on the Infiltrators and Ruststalkers. I guess they are a little bit tougher, but they don't just have quite as much raw damage output. Moving on to the fast attack, I will start out with one of my favourite units, the Cerberus Raiders. These guys, the Sulphur Hounds and the Technoarchaeologist units are all core, so they can get access to quite a lot of buffs within the Codex, and their profile has been changed quite a bit. They used to be 3 wounds at toughness 3, now they're only 2 wounds, but they gained toughness 4 and got a 5+ invul save from enhanced bionics. Overall, that still probably makes them easier to kill compared with when they had 3 wounds. Damage 2 weapons are really quite prevalent, but the toughness 4 and the 5+ invul certainly helps lessen the blow. Otherwise, they got a stat line boost with 1 extra attack base now, so those cavalry sabres will be a little bit more dangerous. Their galvanic carbine got an extra AP -1, which to be honest I was a bit surprised at. They're already fairly efficient snipers. This makes them some very efficient snipers indeed, even if they have to get a bit close. They also retain their pre-game move and sniping abilities, and they still have Tactica Obliqua, even if it has been nerfed a tiny bit. Overall, for a unit that I was thinking was going to see some fairly hefty nerfs, I think that the Cerberus Raiders have made away quite well. Extra shooting and melee damage, retaining the pre-game move and Tactica Obliqua, and the only trade-off is a small nerf to their toughness. The Sulphur Hounds for 20 points weren't taken quite as much before, and they have seen the same profile changes, including the extra attacks and toughness 4. Their phosphor weapons ignore dense cover like all the rest. Their sulphur breath for their hounds are now AP -2. Their rad saturation has been buffed like the Vanguard for -1 strength and toughness, and they can fire assault and pistol weapons at the same time. Overall, I'd say it's maybe a tiny buff to the unit. Getting a little bit more AP on those breath attacks will make them a bit more hard hitting, and they'll still be at least fairly reliable getting in range, as they can use the stratagem to auto-advance 6 inches. Next up, the Technoarchaeologist Skystalkers remain 17 points per model, and their stat lines are identical to previously, but their abilities have been changed up a bit. They can now fall back and shoot, much like they could when they had the old fly keyword in 8th edition. They gained the 5+ invul from enhanced bionics, so they are a bit more survivable, but they lost both arc grenades and saw away, both of which have been replaced with stratagems. The Technoarchaeologist Sterilizers are 19 points, they again gain the 5+ invul, and instead of falling back and shooting, are able to fall back and charge. Again, I think until any FAQ is issued, perhaps the most important thing with these things is the fact that they can come in and then immediately jump off the board again at the end of the turn, with that slightly silly saw away stratagem. Moving on to the other 2 fast attack choices, we come to the Iron Strider Ballistari, which feel like they might just be one of the biggest winners in the entire book. These things were already taken competitively and run quite often at 65 to 75 points, and they've got the surprise combo of keeping that same points cost, getting major stat line buffs, and also being the heaviest firepower core units out there, meaning that their shooting can become absolutely stratospheric. They are a core Skitarii unit, so could pick up a really easy reroll hits and 1s to wound with the Marshall. Their armor savers become a 3+ from a 4+, so a bit more durable now. Their autocannons just got flatly an extra +50% shots, and they're also assault. They get 6 shots with those twin Cognate autocannons. And the las cannons also picked up the assault keyword and are now damage D3 +3. Again, that's around about a 40% damage buff compared with where they were previously. As it stands, I think that few competitive Admech lists aren't going to include at least a hefty contingent of these guys. If you just want sheer overwhelming firepower, then they're probably one of the best ways to go. And their twin Cognate autocannons are going to be quite a nice tool against Stratagems, which do seem to be sweeping the tournament scene right now. Their brothers, the Sindonian Dragoons, are 70 points with their Taser Lance, dropping to 55 points if you do choose to take the Sniper Rifle. These guys gain some really quite significant durability. They retain their -1 to hit, they gain their 3+ save, and their -1 to hit works both at ranged and in melee now, and that's really quite handy, as melee is exactly where they want to be. Their melee is even stronger as well, they gained an attack, and their Taser Lance became AP -2 from AP -1. Skitarii core units can get a +1 to their strength, and they can also get their exploding Taser Lances to go off on 5s with another stratagem, and just putting it all together means that a charge from these guys is going to be truly devastating. 3 of them, even with no additional buffs, should comfortably kill a toughness 7 vehicle. Never mind if you're playing in Riser, use a Doctrina Imperative, or any of the crazy amount of buffs that you can put on Skitarii core units. Again, they seem like they've made out really well out of this new codex. I'd be expecting to see quite a lot of chicken walkers on the table sometime soon. Finally, their Radium Jezzail gains AP -2 up from AP 0, so it's a little bit more of a threat as a sniper weapon now. Still just seems a bit underwhelming for the big platform that it's mounted on. It still remains a pretty mediocre damage 1. Next we come to the heavy support, and we'll start out with the Castellan robots. They've seen a couple of stat line boosts. They now go up to 7 wounds, and you can now mix and match between the Castellan Fists and the Fist Phosphor Blasters. The Fists will each give you an extra attack at Strength +4, AP -3 and Damage 3, and the Phosphor Blasters in their fists now weirdly only get 24-inch range, only get AP -1, but they do go up to damage 2. The Incendium Combustor also gains a pip of AP, going to AP -2 now. Their protocols have been quite heavily changed. The Aegis protocol now just gives them a 2+ save. The Conqueror one gives you 2+ weapon skill and also re-rolling charges, and the Protector one gives you a ballistic skill 3+, but you can't move. Unlike before, when it was a bit questionable whether or not you'd want to take a Cybernetica Datasmith, I think typically you will want to take one with these guys. It now allows you to change your protocol with an action. You do it at the end of your movement phase, and it finishes at the end of your next command phase, and he also makes Castellan robots within 3 inches core. That means that they could get re-rolls from a Tech Priest Dominus, or use some of the buffs from the Cult Mechanicus Warlord Traits. Unfortunately, he can't do both at once, as doing actions switch off the core re-rolls, so you basically have to choose between changing protocols or keeping the core keyword active, unless you take multiple Datasmiths. The Gamma Pistol's been tweaked a bit. It doesn't re-roll wounds anymore, but it gains damage 3. The Datasmith does have the Doctrina Assembler tag, and he also comes without a slot if you do take a unit of Castellans, so it's not hard to include him if you have them about. Overall, they seem fairly solid at first glance. It's going to be interesting to see whether their numbers quite get them there. Obviously, they've massively shifted in what they do. They no longer just sit there and delete loads and loads of things with double shooting, but they're a little bit tougher. Their melee's seen some buffs, and they're one of the only core Cult Mechanicus units, provided you have a Datasmith around. Finally, for the heavy support, we come to the Scorpius Disintegrator and the Onager Dreamcrawlers, two of the standard gun platforms for the army. The Scorpius Disintegrator has come down slightly in points to 145, and has seen a bit of a side grade. The heavy stubbers have been buffed a bit, they're all 4 shots now, but the Belleros Energy Cannon has dropped down to strength 5, making it really quite underwhelming to take, even if you accept that you're paying the massive premium for Ignore's line of sight firepower. Generally, they seem like fairly reasonable firepower for the points, though not being core is going to hold them back compared with the Iron Striders. I guess you could buff 1 or 2 of them by using an Engine Seer. The Onager Dunecrawlers are 115 points, and either taking the Neutron Laser or the Heavy Stubber would each cost you 5 points extra. Again, they're not core, and now they no longer have the overlapping force field special rule, where it gets better when you're nearby other Onagers. It just remains a 5+ invul now. Every single one of the Onager's guns has been buffed in some way, maybe to slightly try and outweigh the loss of core. The Icarus Array doesn't get any penalty to firing against ground units, and now rather than launch all the weapons into one target, you can now freely split fire where it makes sense. The Eradication Beamer is significantly nastier up close. It remains heavy D6 up close, sorry not heavy 6 as I wrote here, and the short range profile is strength 8, AP -4 and flat damage 3. The Neutron Laser goes up to strength 12 and damage D3 +3, so some nice uncomplicated anti-tank there, but I'm not sure exactly how well it's going to compete against Iron Striders with Cognis Las Cannons. You just get a fair bit more anti-tank for the points with firing those guys. Finally, the Onager Phosphor Blasters have been buffed a bit. They're 36-inch range, heavy 8, strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2. Not too bad against virtually any target, but not particularly stand out either. For me, maybe the Icarus Array might be one of the stronger choices. Not suffering the -1 to hit is pretty nice. Finally, for the datasheets, we have the Transports and Flyers. The Scorpius Dune Rider looking much improved in the new Codex, dropping 5 points to 95 points per model. It's both dropped in points, making it tougher for the points. Its transport capacity has bumped up to 12, so you can include a full 10-man Skitarii squad and also attached characters. And all 4 of its heavy stubbers have gone up to heavy 4 shots, so it'll be pouring out 16 shots on the move, and it can also advance and still chip away with its firepower. These things were already taken fairly regularly before. I don't think that that's going to change now. One thing that people were wondering about is if it might get an open tops rule so you could fire out of it, but I'm afraid that has not happened. In general, the Archaeopter's raw stats are pretty much the same. They've picked up the extra shot on stubbers as well. They generally remain the same points cost, aside from the Transvector going down a little bit, and in general they remain very usable. The Transvector still only has the very tiny transport capacity of 6 infantry models, but they did pick up an interesting and slightly weird special rule where you can use 2 of them as a sort of weird Skitarii drop pod. Basically, you can select up to 12 models from your army, you put 2 Transvectors and those models in reserve, and then they come in from reserve, and those models must immediately be disembarked once the Transvectors have been set up. They have to be 9 inches away from enemy models, but still that could allow for some decent Alpha Strike potential, as they can actually come in turn 1 and break the normal reserve special rules. I guess that can be a potential fun way to get around their lack of transport capacity. I guess you're paying a massive premium to be able to do an Alpha Strike on the enemy. I guess perhaps could be best with something like Electro Priest with Corpuscari shooting. Being able to blaze away at the enemy from turn 1 could be quite powerful, I guess. From there you'd be able to just use your annoying Archaeopters as just harassment units, jumping around the board and chipping away with those stubbers. For the various Archaeopters, chaff launchers still cost 20 points, they still give you -1 damage, and they've also interestingly picked up the smokescreen keyword, so you can get a reactive -1 to hit when the enemy shoots at you. Could be handy if they drop into hover mode, or even if they're targeted by anti-air stuff that gets +1 to hits against aircraft. The Strataraptor's basically unchanged, very fast movement, gets the Cognis las cannon buff, but isn't core anymore. Still pretty potent with that amount of firepower on such a fast moving platform. And the Fusillade remains 130 points, and their bombs have been slightly improved against vehicles. They now roll 6 dice per monster or vehicle in the unit, with mortal wounds going off on 4s. I think that's quite a nice rebalancing, to be honest. It actually doesn't feel completely useless and underwhelming against vehicles now. You could conceivably think about bombing vehicles as well as just large infantry squads, as it usually wants to do. Overall, out of the 3, I would still expect to see the Fusillade seeing the most play. A pretty great disruption unit with the seismic bomb stratagem, and its mortal wound damage output has only got better. I'm still not sure that the transvector option is quite worth it, even with that weird drop pod mechanic, but it certainly sounds good fun to try out. So that brings us to the end of the datasheet reviews, and our review in general of the new Admech Codex. Overall, the book seems really strong to me, a few nerfs, and maybe some of the easiest shooting castles have gone the way of the dodo. You can't just cluster up everything around Core and the Exploding Six's Warlord Trait and just go to town on everyone. Though I still think that the strength of the gun lines is still there, it just needs to be a bit more intelligent in the way that the buffs are applied. I think for the most part they've done quite well on toning down on quite a lot of the most auto-included units or options. I was honestly expecting the things like the Exploding 5's arc weapon trait to go away, and I'm not too surprised they've clamped down a bit on things like canticle manipulation. However, the shooting in this book looks absolutely insane. Some of the strongest things about the Codex in general are the overlapping Doctrinas and Canticles in Mars. Both of those layered with the hit rerolls seems just like an all-round strong army. There's a fair few fights last abilities out there, could be pretty nice in combo with the Electro Priests or Sindonian Dragoons. That silly combo of infinitely deep striking sterilizers, very likely to get FAQ'd, but currently remains one of the strongest things I think, and I quite like the way that you can get so many layered buffs on certain units, say between the character's innate buffs, relics, warlord traits, and then holy orders stacked on top of them. I think HQ building is going to be quite interesting. You're really going to have to think about what sort of units you want to make better. Units wise, I think that the new Marshall will be very popular. He provides really efficient buffs. I'm really keen to see if big blocks of Rangers and Vanguard become a regular thing. I wonder if Admech might have the potential to be a horde army now. 120 Rangers, for example, for just under 1,000 points, and you're looking at a crazy 240 strength 4 shots at 30-inch range. Most armies don't want to get hit by that. I think Iron Striders are going to be everywhere. They have heavy firepower, really efficient for the points, fairly tough, and they're also core units. I think that Games Workshop hasn't really balanced their firepower particularly well. They're going to see absolutely tons of play, and most probably slightly outcompete things like the Disintegrators and the Dune Crawlers. Cerberus Raiders still look awesome. Their screening and Tactica Obliqua is going to be a real nuisance for the opponent trying to close with the Admech. I think that Riser could be fun to attempt an Admech melee build or two. Maybe with the Electro Priests in particular, +1 to wound looks amazing. And I still think that Cataphren Servitors will see a bunch of play just for their sheer stats alone, even if you can't do too much clever with their synergies. So anyway, really hope you enjoyed the review. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and particularly anything obvious that I missed or misunderstood. I'm sure there'll be plenty of it, seeing as it's a new codex, and there's lots of options. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I will keep these regular 40k reviews coming regularly, and I will review each codex as it comes out. Finally, if you have enjoyed the video, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page. Making crazy long reviews like this takes an enormous amount of time when you have to go through everything. This one's taken me literally days to make. If you are getting good value out of the videos, any support keeping them coming is enormously appreciated. I do try and give a few advantages for channel patrons, seeing certain new videos early, regular votes on what sort of things come next, and automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits every month. If you'd like to support this sort of content keeping coming, feel free to check those out down in the link in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.